In cultures where succession is operationalized as a development function, and this is what we have discovered, is that succession, when it's working well, looks like development.
Welcome to another episode of Care to Lead, where today we're thrilled to have Matt Paese, Senior Vice President of Leadership Insights for GDI. And I'm really thrilled to have him today. He's a distinguished expert in succession planning, and he's a visionary in leadership development. In his insightful conversation with us for Authority Magazine, Matt dived into the intricacies of succession planning, which is so necessary. It's a critical and often overlooked aspect of organizational success. With a rich background in guiding companies through leadership transition, Matt brings a unique perspective on how to prepare for and execute effective succession strategies. His approach not only ensures business continuity, but also fosters an environment where emerging leaders are nurtured and prepared for future challenges. Welcome to the Care to Lead podcast, the show that dives deep into the art of communication and leadership, bringing insights from the foremost thinkers and corporate trailblazers. Matt, did I leave anything out that you would like to share?
Yeah, well, there's a few things my mother would have added, but we'll leave that out for now. You did great, Cynthia. Thank you so much. Very nice to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you. Today, we're going to explore deeper into your strategies and experiences where we can gain the insights into how succession planning can be a pivotal factor in the long-term resilience and growth of an organization. And I personally, in my coaching, have seen so many organizations with their 4 quadrants and, thinking all this through. But there's a whole bunch of aspects to transition and succession planning that we don't even think of. So in your interview, you mentioned how early in your career you realized the significance of transitions and leadership. So how has this shaped your approach to succession planning?
One of the first things that I think I noticed as I was growing in my career is that there are emotions that are associated with when you're learning really quickly. And I've asked this question to a lot of people over the years. When you're learning faster than ever, when you're learning at highest velocity, what emotion is most closely associated with that? And people use 2 words. They talk about fear and they talk about excitement. And when you realize that succession management involves preparing people, and that so often we never have enough time to get anyone 100% ready, that means that we're all going to be stepping into things that challenge us beyond our levels of readiness. There's always going to be some thrill to that. There's often going to be some fear to that. And I think we have to acknowledge that when we start thinking about how do we build systems that, I don't want to institutionalize fear, but I do want to create a lot of excitement. And I do want people to recognize that there's risk associated with growing talent and growing it faster than it might grow just by natural causes.
That's an interesting concept. And it's also what I find, and I hear often, is one of the reasons people don't focus as much on succession planning. I mean, maybe the C-suite is focused on it, strategically, but as you go down and everyone knows they should be kind of training their replacement and being replaceable, overwhelm, especially today, overwhelm seems to be their biggest reason why we can't do this. What are your thoughts on overwhelm?
Well, you're right. We hear it a lot. Overwhelm, time, pressure. If there's a Venn diagram of, life and work, the circles are coming closer and closer together all the time and overlapping more and more. And so there are legitimate pressures on people that cause them to have to think about and deal with more things than perhaps ever before. It seems to be getting worse and worse, or more and more challenging. And so as you ask an organization to plan for the future and prepare for, the future, and that means looking at a leader and saying, look, you have a big job right now, and we're going to ask you to think out into the future as well. We have to be prepared for how we address that risk, because it is risk. And what I think, if you look at the failure rates, for example, of executives, what we know is that if we have to go outside to hire an executive from the outside, there's probably about a 50-50 chance of success when we bring them in. If we hire someone from inside, their chances of success go up significantly. And if we have good development systems, they go up very significantly. This is research that just came out this past year as part of our global leadership forecast. And when you look at the difference between hiring an external executive versus bringing up an executive or a leader, really not just an executive, any leader within your organization, you go from about a 50-50 chance of success to more like a 75% chance of success. There's never any guarantee, but your ability to change the odds in your favor is pretty dramatic.
Absolutely. You mentioned systems. Would you like to talk a little bit about what those systems might look like? And maybe you can gear it like for a large, like Fortune 500 company systems, and like maybe you're a small startup or, just a smaller company.
Yeah, I think large or small, what a lot of organizations don't realize is how much they can and how easily they can generate data about growth. And this is accessible to any size organization. And when I say data about growth, it's data, yes, about the strengths and weaknesses that people have and where they are today, but even more importantly, how they're developing and growing, what development achievements they've accomplished. So I have a quick example. This was a fairly senior level succession scenario, 2 candidates. And there was a window of time during which the candidates had to develop before the committee had to make a decision about who the successor was going to be. And they were clearly leaning toward the longer tenured player, the one who had been with the company the longest. There was another potential successor who had only been with the company 4 or 5 years. But at the end of the about 6 or 9 month development period, they interviewed each of the candidates about their development. And essentially, the committee did a complete 180 because they started asking questions like, what risks have you taken with your development? Where have you made yourself somewhat vulnerable to other people's feedback? Where have you taken chances with your own growth? And the unexpected candidate, the one who had less experience, absolutely blew the committee away because they had embraced their own growth and development in a way that said, boy, this isn't just about the profile of a person. We have good data about both of these people. If we just look at that, that's one piece of data. But the second piece of data was, how are they responding to their opportunities for growth? And in that instance, one candidate absolutely blew the other one out of the water. And, look back now today, this is about 18 months ago, almost 2 years. The candidate who was selected is continuing to develop and grow right through, not up to the selection decision, but right through it, through the first couple of years, and is flourishing in ways that they never saw coming.
That's awesome. It actually reminds me of something that I tell hiring managers to think about when they're hiring, because they'll get a resume and they'll look at somebody and they'll say, well, this person has 30 years experience and this person only has 5. And I'm like, you can have 30 years of experience or you can have 1 year of experience 30 different times. And that's exactly
Right.
what you're saying. Just numbers on a resume or numbers in years in an organization aren't necessarily as indicative as we might think so.
So true. A simple metaphor that we asked our clients to think about is, imagine you're at a track meet and you're watching athletes run past. The impulse might be to get your camera and take photographs of people. And what we asked people to think differently about is, sure, those photographs are going to be useful. You'll get really important data from those, but also spend some time, get out on the track and run next to people, run with them, find out what it's like when they're actually exerting themselves. So this is not just performance management and watching what people are doing in performance management, but when people take developmental assignments, let's watch the way they respond to those and let's gather insights during the learning process, because for us, learning is data. Development is data, because as we make decisions about people, if we can reframe the succession challenge from just a decision to development, then we get better preparation and we get a stronger bench.
That makes me curious to ask, what specific traits do you believe are most crucial for future leaders in this context of succession?
Yeah, I'm going to start with what you have mentioned already, which is that if you ask your typical senior leader who's trying to staff an organization with really strong leaders, many of them will default to experience. They want to talk about experience. And sometimes, of course, not sometimes, you always have to have certain minimum criteria for experience. But what tends to be the big differentiators in performance is not experience. It's the skills that people have and whether they have the disposition, the personality characteristics to fit inside the business and culture context that they're in. So, there's going to be things like your interpersonal skills. Can people build networks, which is a really important skill in today's environment? Can they reach out, not just make relationships or meet people, but can they build network value so that they contribute to networks and then can draw from them when they need to? That's a really key skill. Innovation, which is not about just being creativity or being creative on one's own merit, but it's sparking innovation in a team of people, which causes people to question the way we do things. That's a very different, I don't have to be creative myself to be an innovative leader. That's another really important characteristic in today's environment. But then we could talk about personality characteristics, of which there are many. And, there are things like, do people have openness? Do they have an ability to listen? Are they empathetic? Do they have emotional intelligence in addition to cognitive intelligence? These are things that in order to lead in today's environment, people, if you can't bring a minimum level of those capabilities along with your experience, there's a better chance that you're going to struggle.
I agree 100% with everything that you said. And one other thing that I think creeps into this, especially for senior leaders who've been in an organization for a very long time, is they look down along their and their downline teams and they start thinking about these characteristics. How often do you think that unconscious bias steps in? And I guess the best analogy is to say, if you see a friend you haven't seen in 10 years and you see that friend's children, and all of a sudden they're like, teenagers, and the last time you saw them, they were like 6, and you still kind of remember them as 6, and you're really shocked to see them, all these years later. In organizations, I think sometimes leaders still see an employee the way they were when they came in, even if they're growing, even if they're changing, even if they're developing. There's sometimes an unconscious bias. Do you want to speak on that at all?
I think we have to acknowledge that unconscious bias is more common than we may realize because it's unconscious. We're all susceptible to it. And if we pay attention to our data at DDI, if we pay attention to the data that's everywhere around us today, we just have to acknowledge that we all bring biases to our own ways of thinking about things. And a lot of some of our recent research, I'm gonna take a slightly different angle on it because there's a crisis in organizations that is related to this that has to do with how we garner trust in our organizations, which does have to do with our openness, which does have to do with whether people feel as though this is a place where I can come and belong and be included and have a future. And trust is one of the foundational components to that. Our data suggests that very significant proportions of people don't trust senior management and don't even trust their direct manager to make good decisions. It's in the 30 to 40% range. I could get specifics for you if you'd like. But when leaders are seen by their teams and their people as showing some propensity to be vulnerable once in a while, their trust data skyrockets. It jumps way up. And so what we know is that if we acknowledge, for example, our inclination to even accidentally and unconsciously show bias, if we are prepared to say, I don't think I know the answer here, if we are prepared to acknowledge that, look, I happen to be the leader of this team, but I'm growing like all of you at the same time. Here's a couple of things that I'm working on. All of a sudden, our ability to contribute, our ability to feel involved, to feel included jumps way up when leaders acknowledge this simple thing that doesn't come naturally, which is that it's not only okay for me to be vulnerable, it's probably important for me to be vulnerable in key moments. And how each person does that, I think, is a unique individual decision. But the absence of trust in organizations and the inclination for leaders to demonstrate bias, even when they don't intend to, is part of what I think can differentiate cultures. You can be more inclusive, you can demonstrate vulnerability, and all of a sudden you have an environment where trust exists, where out in the world, it's hard to find. We can't always go and find environments that are high trust. I think when you look at the data out there about take Edelman's research, the trust index, businesses are the most trusted institutions these days. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. So this makes it possible for businesses to be a place of refuge for people. They can be the most trusted institution. They can be a place where people show up at work and feel as though it's an extension of home.
As you were speaking, it kind of made me the combination, right? This unconscious bias. So as you're looking at and you're thinking about succession planning, having the vulnerability and the authenticity to even ask yourself as part of your own checklist, could I be wrong? Is my assumption about this person's experience just because I don't interact with them every day, but they've been here for 15 years. I remember their first year, they made this mistake, and that's still in our mind,
right.
That halo and horn effect kind of thing. And if we can just have the vulnerability and the authenticity to say, I could be wrong. And if we start all of our thinking with that, then I think people have a better shot at actually growing in their organizations.
Absolutely. And it goes from frontline leader all the way up to the boardroom, and have seen and hear of leaders who will tell stories precisely like what you're saying. And there's a discovery moment when you make a choice, which can sometimes be hard, especially if you're uncertain about your own performance. And most of us as leaders don't go around with 100% certainty. We're always to some degree uncertain. And in some moments, we're very uncertain. And it's actually in those moments when vulnerability can be the most significant lever in cultivating more trust, cultivating more involvement. And so I really like the way you framed it, because I agree very much.
Do you think it's possible for a leader to inadvertently show too much vulnerability, where it's maybe oversharing or setting back their credibility?
I do. I think there's probably a balance that's necessary. I think if a leader is overly dependent on others to make important judgments, if a leader is overly dependent on others to sort of make a tiebreaker call, in those instances, I think it's okay to say, I'm not positive, but I have to make a decision, and here's my decision. I think those moments are important, and for teams to establish clarity, to not spend too much time ruminating when they need to move forward. I think in those moments, it's possible for there to be too much vulnerability. But I think when we're ideating, when there's a moment when you really need your team's help and contribution, or you need your team to be trying to generate things that you can't think of yourself, I think, and there's a lot of those moments, I think more often than not, it's healthy in those times. But you're right to, I think, ask the question that there can be a limit. And I think when you begin to sacrifice clarity, when you begin to sacrifice being able to prioritize, simplifying things, which is an enormous virtue of good leader these days. Please keep my world simple. Don't make it too complicated. And if my leader is overly needy for help and support, that could get in the way of some of those things.
So if we were to take that the average healthy organization, and it's kind of just a fun question, but I'm curious, because 100% of the organizations I work with tell me succession planning is important. And I'm sure you hear the same thing. We all believe and know that succession planning is important. In your experience, what percentage would you say is actually on track for a solid succession plan?
Well, let's talk about some numbers. If you would have asked me in 2011, 18% of organizations would have said at that time, we have a pretty strong bench. And about every 18 months since then, we've been asking the same questions. And every time we ask the question, the number ticks down a little bit. We're now at 12%.
Did you say 2018 was your starting?
2011 was the starting point. So for about the last 12 years or so, about every couple of years, we've been asking the same in our global leadership forecast. Do you have a strong enough bench? And we're down to 12% right now that say we feel like we have a pretty solid bench. And it's fascinating because that 12%, while it's a small number, they have radically different indicators of the health of their organizations. So, for example, those 12% are about 10 times more likely than their peers to have what their employee population calls strong leadership. They're about 6 times more likely to retain their top talent. They're about 5 times more likely to prevent burnout. They're about 3 times more likely to be top financial performers in their industry sector. I think what we might, and you were signaling this at the beginning, what we can probably acknowledge is that it's challenging to make space in a busy world for succession. And maybe this is why the 18% 12 years ago is 12% today. But if you can manage to do it, and if you can discover that it doesn't take as much extra effort as you may realize, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. If I could just emphasize one thing, it's that in cultures where succession is operationalized as a development function, and this is what we have discovered, is that succession, when it's working well, looks like development. And eventually you have to make a decision. But when you're giving people big chances, when you're giving people big opportunities, when your HR organization is thinking of development experiences like currency, and they're trying to build more and more of it, you start to cultivate a culture that's fundamentally different than a different kind of culture. And it's a fundamentally different performance culture because people begin to seek new experiences. They begin to realize that if they take a big developmental assignment and do a great job with it, that's the way they burnish their reputation. It's not because they make friends with the right person or because they're credentialed with the right, degree or some sort of more artificial criterion. It's because they've actually achieved growth. To summarize our experience, that's the differentiator between an organization that manages to get succession right and has a stronger bench, to your original question, versus one that doesn't.
That's excellent information. I'm curious, how much do you think COVID and the work from home and the whole difference, like the new normal, so to speak, how much does that impact succession planning or make it harder?
Yeah. In an organization that's not thinking about growth and about development, a crisis like COVID is going to make it harder. In an organization that is thinking about opportunities for growth and development, a crisis is an amazing opportunity to watch what people can do differently and watch how people will surprise you when you give them responsibility and some support at the same time. There's very early in my career, I interviewed a chief marketing officer from a very large chemical company who was known and beloved in the organization as the greatest developer of talent. And everyone had sort of regarded him that way for a long time. And I was interviewing him and I said, what's the secret? How do you do it? How have you generated this reputation? And he said, it's very simple. You give people the ball and you don't run away. You stay relatively close and they surprise you with how far they run with it almost every single time. And once you get accustomed to doing that, and he called it getting addicted to doing that, he said, I just got addicted to watching people surprise me with how much they can do. And what I would say is that's been our experience. When we give people opportunities to surprise us, far more often than not, they surprise us in positive ways. And yes, once in a while, people struggle. And once in a while, they have difficulty. But if we recognize that that's always going to happen, and if we make space for people to stumble, we're going to win more often than not. And we're going to be able to respond and ideally become one of the 12%.
What do you think is the biggest mindset shift that has to happen, or a belief system that a leader needs to embrace differently in order to be that person that you just talked about?
Yeah. When I work with boards, I ask them the question, because they're often looking at several candidates, sometimes CEO candidates, or they might be looking at C-suite candidates. And I ask them to think about, how long do you think it takes for these people? How long would you think it would take for them to develop and get ready for a key role that you're thinking about? And then I ask them to think back when they were in jobs like that. And I say, if I had asked you that question when you were in that job, how long would you have said? And every single time, the same thing happens. The board thinks it's going to take other people much longer than they thought it would take them when they were developing themselves. And so there's this, if I could shift the mindset, it's to change people's expectations for how quickly other people can develop. And I think when you're a board of directors, when you're a CEO, when you're a business leader who has a big objective, when you're a first-time leader who's leading a team for the first time, you're feeling the pressure. I have to give other people responsibility now. And that's a huge leap of faith. But what I would say is when you make that leap of faith with some intention and a little bit of process and a few solid leadership skills that you can learn and you can develop, you stack the odds in your favor in ways that we see work over and over again. So that mindset shift that other people can learn faster than I think they can that's the one thing I would change.
I love that. Now, sticking with mindset. All right. I want to go down the totem pole here to just a line supervisor. Succession planning is at that level as well, right? Every person in your organization should be building their bench. So you can't move up. If you don't have anybody to replace you, you're stuck in that role. What kind of mindset things would you suggest? Because a lot of times, in my experience with people at that level, is they're afraid of that person showing them up or that person looking better than them if they delegate. So they want to have their hands in to show their importance. What are some mindset thoughts you could share with someone at that level?
Yeah, I'm going to mention a couple things from our research on this just to make the point a little bit more salient. So if you look, there's probably 4 or 5 competency areas that leaders will say are super critical. And I'm talking about first line leaders for the most part, will say these are super critical. So the ability to make change, for example, is a big one. Another one is the ability to lead across or to influence across boundaries. So just grabbing a couple out of probably another 3 or 4 that are among the top ones that people recognize when they get in their first leadership job or they're early in their leadership career, around 60+% will say, this is really important to develop. And then something more like 25 or 30% actually ever get any training on it. So take the one that you mentioned. You might say holding people accountable. This is one where a lot of people think that it's hard for me to hold people accountable and be compassionate at the same time. Well, if you actually sit down and spend some time with, spend an hour or 2 in a formal learning course where somebody walks you through a basic model of what good accountability management looks like, and also what good management and empathetic response to your people and the ability to maintain their self-esteem and the ability to have an open and sharing relationship with them. What you realize very quickly through some formal learning is that accountability and compassion are actually not mutually exclusive things. They're not separate. They're actually part of the same thing. And when you become a leader, holding people accountable is part of how you be compassionate to them. And that discovery is one of these things that, until someone shows you in a slightly formal way how that works, it's really hard to invent that out of your own head, because who has any sort of experience doing that before they become a leader for the first time? So it's those sorts of basic lessons that apply to leading change, thinking more, planning in a longer term horizon, influencing across boundaries. Those basic skill sets are things that I think a lot of people don't realize how quickly you can train people to do them. And once a few of these switches turn to the on position in our minds, we become very different leaders. And then it kind of infects the rest of our leadership journey once we learn those. But there's lots of people who never have those switches go on. They make it to the C-suite and no one's ever told them about the intersection between accountability and compassion. And so they just never learned it.
That's absolutely true. And sometimes it's as small as stepping back with a new leader, and especially if the new leader is a parent. And if you can approach it like, why do you let your child fall when they're learning to ride a bike, right? How do you teach that child? Because you want them to grow up to be this productive member of society. Well, as a new leader, your role is the same. I mean, you are there to guide, to pick up the pieces, to support, but have this person grow into a productive member of the organization. And sometimes just that analogy alone can help reframe the mindset. But I love all the data that you are able to place into this.
Oh, thanks, Cynthia. Your point is really right, that it accentuates this point that, everyone thinks about development as the soft stuff. Learning is the soft stuff. We think learning is data. We think development is risk management. And once you reframe it that way and you realize that you can build a culture where people begin to naturally challenge themselves. And over time, if I see my boss struggling with a dilemma that she, is just having trouble figuring out, guess what I do? I start thinking, how can I get into that space? Not because I'm ambitious and I want her job, but because I know that in our company, what we do is we stretch ourselves into the space where help is needed. Could be a peer, could be someone who works for me, could be my boss. But once you establish learning as data, development as risk management, you have a different kind of experience that you're having with the way you manage people and the way you build an inclusive environment and the way you cultivate openness and involvement. And you end up, at the end of the day, Cynthia, you end up getting people exerting more of their discretionary effort in service of the organization's goals. And that's, I think, what we're all trying to do as leaders.
100% agree. I'm curious, just for my own benefit, like I think about this often with AI becoming as prevalent and disrupting industries everywhere. How do you think AI is going to impact the world of succession planning? It's kind of an off-the-wall question, but
it's really interesting. I think we're doing a lot of work on this, and we're watching how in our own research, we can enable AI to do some things that traditionally humans have done. And AI can do it in some cases just as good and in some cases better than humans. But what AI can't do yet is contextualize the information and the data and the language that it's synthesizing. Maybe there will come a day when AI is a context engine, but today, succession and growing in an organization requires that how we observe a person, which AI can absolutely help us with, how we observe what we're seeing or how a person's behavior is being consistent or not over time. AI can assist us with those things, and it will continue to get better. But I think what we as leaders in organizations have to make sure we're doing is saying, what is our context? What's emerging in our context? How do we anticipate what's coming? And succession is in large measure about that exercise, anticipating what's coming on the horizon of our leadership landscape so that we can say, look, let's just not only get ready for what we're looking at right now, but let's do some scenario planning, look at our talent and think about what's around the corner and say, for example, what would we have done 15 years ago had we known about the revolution we were going to face in digital leadership and the importance of being able to lead teams in a digital environment. We would have done a lot of things differently had we seen that coming sooner. And some organizations did do that and really, I think, benefited from it. So one example, but I think we could use that analogy and think about today, what's going to be changing around the next few corners.
Matt, as we wrap up, I want to ask you, what is the one big takeaway that you want listeners and leaders and CEOs and executives who hear this? What is the most impactful thing you can tell them to do or take away about succession planning?
I have one that goes right back to one of the first questions you asked. One of the biggest lessons I've learned in my career, which I've been the beneficiary of because I've had some great leaders who've sparked me in this way. But I think for every leader to look at the people who they have the privilege to lead, and with them construct what I call the big idea. And the big idea is that if I report to you, Cynthia, you're my boss, you and I together, you look at me and you say, Matt, what is your dream in terms of the way you contribute in this company? What do you think you could do? What do you want to do? What's in your aspiration set? And then you get to weigh in as well. And together we construct what I call the big idea. What are we trying to make happen? What's the big developmental objective that we have? And I think what happens too often is what we say is go build a development plan. And then you and I go and we take a form, or we have to fill out some things, and I have to come up with some things that I'm going to develop. And that's good. That's not a bad thing. But I think when we get really excited and we begin to lean into the risk space, it's when that idea becomes a big one. Because if I come up with the idea that's really big, I might make you a little uncomfortable about that. Well, you might say, well, I don't know if I can promise all of that, but I don't know if I need you to promise all of that. All I need you is to help me, and help me nudge myself along the way. So together, if we know that what we're doing is trying to get to a big idea and valuing the big idea, we start to cultivate these much more significant notions of what growth means. And I think in the end, growth doesn't become incremental and piecemeal, because that's where too many organizations are now, and why HR doesn't have a seat at the strategic table in a lot of companies, because learning is incremental and it's piecemeal. But when learning becomes big ideas, when developmental achievement becomes surprising, that's when cultures change, that's when businesses change, and that's when the people who are running a team, a department, a business, a company, they start to say, we can do anything here. Leadership is not my limiter. Leadership is my opportunity. There's companies that do that, and they do it intentionally. And if I were to point to the one thing that I would say is the start of it, it's a lot of big ideas in development.
I love that. I love that. I want to thank you for sharing, because your perspectives have not only shed light on the critical aspect of succession planning, but also you've given practical guidance for our listeners who are navigating their own succession challenges. How would you like people to reach out to you if they want to reach you? Is LinkedIn a great place to go?
LinkedIn is a terrific place, yes. And so I presume that in the links here, you'll see my name. You can find Matt Paese, or you can find Matthew Paese. My last name is spelled a little bit funny, so make sure you don't spell it wrong. But I would love questions, and I would love different perspectives. I'm wrong about a lot of things. I've probably been wrong about a handful of things in this call too, and I'd love for people to tell me what they are.
I think we all have a spouse to do that for us. So thank you again for your time. And to our audience, thank you for joining us on Care to Lead. We hope that today's discussion has provided you with deeper insights and actionable strategies to enhance your leadership and succession planning efforts. Again, thank you very much. And Matt, I can't thank you enough for your time today.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's been terrific. Thank you so much.